Friday the 13th, Carnival of Maniacs, Chapter 3. 3 fireflies were dancing in the night. At first, their luminescence was dwarfed by the blackness of the forest, but as they zigzagged their way forward through the trees, the pinpoints expanded into discs of blinding white. One of these discs remained fixed on the ground, but the others, the beams from Trick and Zemal's flashlights, moved in a sphere of unpredictable tangents. Zemal noticed that the rays were becoming diluted. The moon had risen, and with its ascent, the sky had become a cyclorama of still. The daydreaming teen had never seen a moon so full, so large. They were walking single file, the trail so narrow that they didn't have any choice. Glow was leading the way, Trick stuck to her back like super adhesive, with Zemal stumbling and belly-aching at the rear. Now that they were no longer using the map, or the GPS that they never recovered, Trick kept testing Glow to see if her weird shit was still working. "What's next?" he called. "A ditch on the left with the sweet gum tree wrapped in poison ivy," she replied, uninterested. A few yards on, and Trick's flash confirmed her prediction. The boy had been running this question-and-answer stick all evening. It provided him with a minor comfort zone. Glow had scored 10 out of 10, and that had to count for something. It also confirmed Glow was still alive, because outside her answers, the moody little girl had nothing to say. "What was that?" Trick had heard a splashing sound. "Shit!" He just stepped into a deep puddle that spanned the width of the track. His combat boots kept out the water, but the jolt had shocked him all the same. "Quality. Heads up, Glow," he moaned, but she just kept walking without even acknowledging his gripe. Unfortunately, the boy had stopped so abruptly that Zemal plowed straight into the back of him. She screamed, "Fuck!" The water drenched her fishnets, and the sudden cold around her ankles made her drop her flashlight. The lamp fell into the puddle and promptly went out. "Shit!" Trick said. "The flashlight! Save the fucking flashlight, you whore!" He bent down and swept his left hand through the water, splashing Z's legs. "Stop it! Stop it!" she shouted, and she slapped him on the back of his long coat. "But we need it!" he protested, still waving his hand around. How big was this damn puddle? Glow didn't pay the two of them any attention. She continued along the trail until she saw something, and then stopped. Zemal put her hands on Trick's side and tried to push him over. The boy fought to keep his balance, but was soon occupying a front row seat in the filthy water. Zemal's flashlight was pressing into his left buttock. "This is so fucking the end of our relationship," he shouted as she stepped over him to put her feet back on dry dirt. "You fucking skank witch reject!" Zemal turned, flipped him the finger, and headed off after Glow. Thoughts of Jason-esque homicide ran through Trick's mind as he crawled to his feet, retrieved Zemal's flashlight, and clicked the switch. Nothing. The bulb was dead. Fucking motherfucking cut! He couldn't even bring himself to finish the insult. He hurled the device into a rock where it shattered in a cascade of plastic. Suddenly, he heard Zemal call his name. "Trick! Over here! Come quick!" Was he imagining things, or did the girl sound happy? He turned his light on Zemal. She was pointing at something ahead of her, and yes, she did look excited. She'd caught up with Glow, yet wasn't remotely aware that their mysterious friend seemed to be in some kind of trance. But then neither Trick nor Zemal had noticed that Glow hadn't moved at all since first catching sight of whatever had Zemal so keyed up at the moment. "Trick!" shouted Zemal a second time. He ran over to join her and saw they'd reached the end of the trail. "Where the fuck's Crystal Lake?" he asked indignantly. "Fuck Crystal Lake?" Zemal replied. "This is our ticket home." Glow had led them to a clearing far from any beaten track, that side of the lake. The glade was of considerable size, yet was made to feel oppressive by the overhanging of dead leaves that paved the area between the edge of the clearing and the rundown shack that nestled in its center. It was immediately obvious to Trick that the building wasn't a cabin from the old summer camp, nor was it a vacation lodge near the water's edge. No, this ramshackle dwelling was a low hut hidden from prying eyes, and its assembly spoke of savagery. Discarded boards, sheets of corrugated metal, broken window panes, warped plywood panels, torn measures of tarpaulin, old ropes and fastenings. The lair had been built by a scavenger. Trick rubbed his chin and considered the situation. "And I'm excited because They'll have a phone, Zemal contended. See any lines, genius? All right, Captain Happitude, we'll borrow a car. Trick leaned back and gestured for Zemal to take a good long look at the luxury estate that only she could see. And which one would that be, he asked, sweeping an arm in the direction of thin air. The sporty Ferrari, or the safe but comfortable 4x4? Or would Madame Fuckwit care for the stretch limo? Oh, and while you're making your choice, perhaps you'd like to show me a power line or a generator, or the sign that says Avis Car Rental, or a single fucking light bulb. Now it was Zemal's turn to be upset by the way Trick punctuated his sentences with shouting. Screw you, she said. Then she turned on her heels and made for the shack. Don't, said Glow. It took the girl to speak in order for her friends to notice how silent she'd been. What's up, girl? Trick laid a hand on her shoulder. Don't go in there, was all she said, louder than normal. Glow could hear the voice all the time now. It was constant, encouraging her, urging her forward. With every step Glow had taken, the words had become louder and more distinct. They had led her through the woods, and gained strength with each passing yard until now. Glow knew that this glade had been her destination all along. This shack was where the voice wanted her to be. And yet, despite surrendering to the voice, and leading her friends on with easy little lies about moving closer to the lake, Glow's instinct now was to turn back, to run, to get away from this evil place. Come along now, dear, said the voice as clearly as if from someone standing beside her. I'm waiting for you. Glow gripped her temples and wailed, Get out of my head! But we'd become such good friends, said the voice persuasively. Zemal smiled at her boyfriend. She's out of her head, all right? Come on, let's go find a door. Even though it was almost impossible for Glow to hear past the voice, she had to warn her friends. She had to fight. But how much determination did a 15-year-old have? Enough. She stood fast against the flood tide of spectral delusions and managed to disgorge a single word of caution. Don't! But how much trust and loyalty did the two other 15-year-olds possess? Could they even begin to empathize with or understand what Glow was going through? You're a freak, said Zemal. When they got back to Seattle, she'd be filing Glow under ancient history. Even Trick wasn't sure anymore that the girl wasn't just an oddball. Okay, her ghostly positioning sense had brought them here, but now she was behaving as if she was having a bad substance reaction. And what if Zemal was right? The shack didn't look much, but what if there was some slappy old hick in there who could help them escape the forest? The boy was still unsure what to do when Zemal saw something that made his mind up for him. Look at that, she said, indicating part of the wooden patchwork. Can you be any less specific there? She grabbed his flashlight and shone the beam over by one of the cracked windows, a point where the wall appeared particularly clumsy in construction. They're all parts of bunk beds, she said. The light played over the area Zemal was talking about. Ooh, there's a sign on my back saying, Kick me, answered Trick sarcastically, but then he took a closer look. His jaw dropped. Zemal was right. The section of wall next to the left window was definitely the side of a cot, and that part near the corner, Trick snatched the flashlight out of Z's hand, was a door lying on its side. Then he saw an old notice board made of cork, and a strip of white slats that could have only come from a boat dock. Suddenly it hit him. The shack had been assembled from the remnants of Camp Crystal Lake. There couldn't be any doubt. Fucking A! He cheered. Then he grabbed Zemal by the hand. Come on, let's do it. Glow tried to stop them, but it was no use. They ran off around the side of the hut and swiftly disappeared from view, in search of a door. Behind them, Glow was racked with anxiety. The voice was too strong to resist, and it was telling her to put one foot in front of the other, and then the other, and then the other. The girl tried everything she could to stop herself from walking, but the shack loomed larger and larger. She was succumbing to an amplification of madness brought on by the full moon. And only now, when it was almost too late, did Glow realize she was fighting for her very soul. Alice helped her father down the folding steps of the motorhome. The elderly man had to take one cautious step at a time. Alice was sick of doing the same thing day after day and wondered if her role shouldn't be changed to unpaid care worker. For his part, George seemed most grateful for his daughter's assistance. "Thank you, my dear," he said tenderly, though Alice didn't know if this was a mark of honest gratitude or merely an expression of his usual impeccable manners. Indeed, no sooner had the soles of his shoes scuffed the asphalt than the old man, walking cane in hand, tottered off in the direction of the long trailer that stored virtually the entire show. The wax models, the banners, the scenic backcloths, the electrics, even the diesel generator. If anything ever happened to the 18-wheeler, the carnival would be finished. They weren't even insured. Alice sighed and shook her head. They'd pulled up at a neglected RV park on the edge of a small town called Crystal Lake. She never did find it on any map, but its self-evident reality meant she needed to buy a better road atlas. That is, when she could afford one. There were no other vehicles in the park. As a matter of fact, the place looked like it hadn't been used in over a decade. But that's exactly why Alice had chosen it. She hoped there wouldn't be any attendants around to come take their money, and the site had the additional advantage of being hidden from town by a low hill and a band of trees. If nothing else, they should be able to get a good night's sleep. Best case, they'd announce their presence to the locals in the morning and maybe do a little business. Alice picked up a voltmeter along with the RV's heavy-duty power cord and walked around to the AC hookup on the other side of the truck. She wasn't optimistic, but the coach battery needed some juice. By now, the other showmen had also got out of their vehicles, and one of them, Judge, was helping her father unlatch the massive doors at the back of the semi. Alice was the only woman with the show, but as far as the other carnies were concerned, she was one of the guys, except, of course, when she wanted to get one of them in the sack. She didn't know if having sex with the other showmen was a good idea. These people were practically family, but they all seemed to enjoy it and never caused a problem. After all, it was only for fun. The guys knew from the onset that the occasional drunken hump with Alice meant nothing. There was no jealousy or commitment. It was just life on the road. It always amazed Alice how easy it was to recruit new people to the carnival. It wasn't a big show, just 10 dummies, a few lights, a public address system, and Dr. Geistman's pitch. And they never made any money. But whenever anyone quit, her father couldn't keep the kids from wanting to join up. 4 of the 5 guys currently with the show were younger than Alice. They all had this crazy romantic idea about touring high-grass places like Crystal Lake with a carnival of horror, as if they were living the dream of a black-and-white monster movie. None of them particularly cared about a salary or a career. They just wanted a roof, some food, and a rush of nostalgia, which pretty much put them in the same camp as the rubes they were meant to be bilking. Alice took time out to see how everyone was coping after the long day spent snaking through the backwaters of New Jersey. Judge was the juice man. An Irishman, he drove the semi, maintained the generator, wired up the show, and had recently sunk all his savings into a laptop computer. These past few weeks, Alice had been talking him into building a website for the show. He was almost finished, but his desire to learn everything about HTML meant that he never worked quickly enough for her. Judge was one of those guys who had to master the nuts and bolts of everything. When he'd successfully uploaded their homepage for the first time, he felt like the guy who split the atom. Vincenzo and Sparks, on the other hand, were pure manpower. Between them, they had the arduous task of setting up and tearing down the show. And when they weren't moving the displays, they were maintaining or fixing them, or even improving them. In his downtime, Sparks fooled around with special effects and makeup. Stuff like fake wounds and rubber masks. If you ever wanted a head to explode in front of a live audience, and you wanted the chumps to go screaming into their cell phones for the police, Sparks was your man. It was partly because of the boy's astonishing talent that Alice knew the show could be so much better. Vincenzo, too, was totally reliable, but only when Alice gave him a thorough brief to work from. Self-motivation was not a specialty. On the plus side, he seemed to know every dealer north of Mexico. Whenever she needed any beanies to get through an all-day stint, she went straight to Vincenzo. Finally, she looked across at Minter. Heck, she loved Minter. He was the show's muscle. Sometimes he used his brawn for lifting, but most times he used it to flatten faces when business got rough. 2 other qualities in Minter's favor were that he could hold his liquor against Alice any time, and he was like a jackhammer in the sack. More importantly, he had an ocean of a heart. He was always around to help. and the way he fussed over her father. He behaved more like a Whitney than she did, though his Afro-American origin was one indication that he might not be George's son. But it would have been a mistake to dismiss Minter as the cliché gentle giant. The man had a brain well in proportion to his 6'4" body. Point of fact, Sean Minter was the sharpest guy Alice had ever met. The fifth showman, however, Kenton Freely, was the only member of the carnival who joined before Alice was born. Now in his 50s and with a fashion sense to match, it was Kenton's job to sell tickets. Whose crazy idea was that? Every time Alice followed him into town to check how well he was promoting the show, she found him propping up a bar. Every time she watched him take gate receipts, she saw him issue tickets to only 3 out of every 4 townies. Everyone else in the group doubled up and helped out whatever they could. Odd jobs, fetching stuff, managing the public, you name it. But Kenton never lifted a finger. He just went where the money was, and Alice was certain he was raking oats in addition to the hard cash he pocketed from withheld tickets. On top of which, the guy was a total creep. He only had to speak, and Alice's skin crawled. And she wasn't the only one. Freely swaggered around like he owned the place, when the truth was that everyone else, Alice especially, wished he would just go suck on an exhaust pipe. Why her dad didn't just get rid of the gold brick was a mystery to all of them. Just now, Kenton was standing by his pickup. That truck was the only piece of carnival equipment that didn't belong to her dad. And Kenton literally lived in the rust heap. He carried supplies and equipment in the back and drove, ate, and slept up front. After all, Alice sure as hell wasn't going to let him sleep in her and her dad's RV. Likewise, the 3 beds in the other motorhomes were reserved for Sparks, Vincenzo, and Minter. The amount of physical work those guys did, they needed quality rest. And it made sense for Judge to use the sleeper in the 18-wheeler because he drove the thing all day. So poor little Kenty was forced to sleep all by his shitty little self. Alice plugged the voltmeter into the park's electric outlets and was amazed to find it still working. Whoever it was who'd closed the place must have forgotten to turn off the juice. She wondered if they were still paying utility bills. She called across to Vincenzo and told him to hook up the other RV. Then she plugged in the cord and went to look for her dad. George was inside the long trailer and was checking to see if the models had survived the journey intact. A process of inspection he carried out immediately after every ride. Judge had helped the old man climb inside the truck, but now Whitney was completely alone. Lamps had been fitted along the length of the ceiling, and he'd switched them on so that he could carry out his examination. He leaned forward and stared into the eyes of Dracula, shaking his head. "What's wrong?" came a voice from behind, making the old man jump. "Too scary for you?" George turned and saw Kenton. "That's Mr. Freely to you, George." Kenton was standing just inside the open doors. He slicked back his hair, and it clung to his head like a skull cap of leeches, while his shirt and pants looked like they'd been stolen from the set of I Love Lucy. Smart casual threads for the out-of-touch hepcat on a budget. "I was just thinking," commented Whitney, turning back to study the model, "that our Count here is looking somewhat anemic. He could do with a fresh lick of red paint." No response. "I said," repeated George, "the Count could do with some fresh paint." Whitney turned and saw that Kenton was staring out of the trailer, but he didn't know that Kenton was leering at his daughter. Kenton liked the way she manhandled those thick power lines, and when she bent down to plug them in, seeing her dress fold around her body like that made his cock tingle. "Freely!" barked the old man. A snarl cracked the corner of Kenton's mouth. He turned on his heels, bowed forward, and seized Whitney by the lapels of his jacket. "Don't you speak to me like that, you old bastard!" Freely kept his voice low so no one outside could hear him. The old man shivered but held his ground. We need some paint," he said, trembling. Freely liked that. He liked to see Whitney shitting bricks. Suddenly he released his grip and pushed George back, so that the elderly showman almost crashed into Dracula's outstretched claws. Kenton sniggered. "Give me the money, and I'll send someone for your goddamn paint." "Don't bother," said George, collecting himself. "They'll be nowhere open till morning anyway. Don't worry, Kenton. I'll send Alice." Freely took another step forward. George took another step back. and found himself standing next to a wax rendition of the Frankenstein monster. Kenton ran a finger over the blood on Dracula's fangs. A can of paint? His threats were like silk. Oh, I'd say that's at least a Benjamin. $100? Gasped Whitney. Don't be absurd. Freely laughed and continued his menacing advance. I love that short-tongued thing you do. $100, that little growl, he mimicked. Don't be absurd. Whitney raised his walking stick as if preparing to strike the weasel across the face. Don't come any closer. Don't come any closer, mocked Freely. George, do we have to go through this every time? You know that I always win. Now you listen to me, Freely. But Whitney had barely begun to reassert his authority when he was caught short by a pain in the chest. He started to cough. I'm listening, George, Kenton smirked, but all I'm hearing is an old man having a heart attack. What's going on? It was Alice. Nothing, dear. Dear, it's okay, coughed the old man. Alice grabbed on to one of the metal latches and pulled herself up into the trailer. Kenton Freely stood back, moving away from her father. Then he looked Alice up and down. I'm sure I've seen that dress before, he said slyly. Alice pushed right past him, knocking him aside with her shoulder. Freely, you're so fucking predictable. This is the bit where you remind me I'm wearing my dead mom's clothes and how she died in a carnival accident when I was only 4 years old. Boo fucking who? Kenton tried not to show pain, but he knew he'd bruised where she'd knocked into him. Bitch. Alice placed an arm over her father's shoulders and began to escort him in the direction of the door. The old man's walk was no more than a shuffle, and he was coughing uncontrollably. Dad? Alice looked concerned. The old man can't hack it, said Freely, enjoying the moment. Maybe it's time he made way for young blood. Alice whipped her head in Freely's direction. Young blood? An oily old fuck like you? Alice, her father spluttered. Leave it be, child, leave it be. He raised a hand to silence her. But Dad! You heard Daddy, smiled Freely. Now be a good little girl and get off my case. He turned and jumped down from the trailer, leaving George and Alice Whitney alone with their mannequins. Hell, the dummies looked so cheesy. Alice could have wept. She swore that if she ever found one, just one person who'd actually found any of this crap scary, she'd take a vow of celibacy, give up Jack Daniels, and go join the nearest convent. I don't get it, Dad, she said. The old man's coughing fit had subsided, so she took her arm off him and moved round to look him in the eye. The guy's a freeloader, she went on. Why do you take so much shit from him? Please, her father begged. Change the subject. You wouldn't understand. I understand when some loser is trying to fuck you over. I won't discuss this any further, answered George firmly. He began to walk to the door, even though he had no way of getting down from the trailer without Alice's help. But Alice stayed right where she was. What is it with you and Freely? She persisted, talking to the back of his head. Every time I mention him, the same old wall keeps coming down. You wouldn't understand, Alice. I don't want to talk about it, Alice. Well, make me understand, Dad. Whitney kept his back turned towards her. When he spoke, his voice was unnaturally calm, almost as if he were struggling to control it. Perhaps if you weren't always so rude, so confrontational all the time, you and Kitten might get along. Alice turned George around, and the whole carnival heard what she had to say next. So that bastard corners you, he threatens you, he tells you to hand over the show, and then he talks about Mom like it's a fucking joke, and it's my fault? I'm just saying that perhaps if you spent less time fraternizing with the more junior members, and maybe less time drinking. I was wondering when you were going to bring that up. George could always tell when Alice was really angry, because her voice would suddenly drop to a low monotone, and she clipped every syllable, just like she was doing now. Please, Alice, he said, let's not fight. Alice walked forward and jumped down onto the asphalt. "Get someone else to fetch you down," she snapped, storming off and leaving a tearful old man in her wake. Freely stood by his pickup and watched the hard-nosed bitch march in the direction of her RV. And look at George, the stupid old bastard couldn't get down from the truck. He just had to stand there and cry like a baby until somebody fetched him. Well, Kenton wasn't going to play wet nurse, not until Whitney stumped up his $100. Freely always parked his truck a little away from the others because that was how he liked it. It made it easier for him to keep an eye on everyone, and it made it harder for them to come snooping through his stuff. "Well, would you look at that?" murmured Kenton. Sean Minter was running to the old man's aid, but the big lunk was so muscle-bound it was like watching a buffalo tottering in high heels, as if playing the Whitneys off against each other already wasn't fun enough. He now had Queen Kong prancing on his pointy little toes, coming to the rescue. Freely burst out laughing, only to hear someone laughing along with him. Kenton had parked near the edge of the lot. There was someone hiding in the surrounding bushes. "Who's there?" Kenton challenged. The only answer he got was more inane giggling. "Come on out," he tried again. This time he was successful. A beraggled mess of a man fell through the bushes and landed with a thump on the asphalt. He was clutching a bottle of single malt in his left hand. "Jesus," said Kenton. "The town drunk. That's all I need." If Winos had a union, and there were regulations governing the appearance of its members, Jonah would have been fully compliant. The matted hair, the missing teeth, the grime, it was all textbook stuff, and he insisted on singing every single word. "Oh, brothers a-comin' to Crystal Camp, blood, here to die. Gonna cut your fucking throat, friend, and stick a chopper in your eye." Kenton hiked his thumb at the inebriate. "Go on, beat it." The wino snickered and rose shakily to his feet. "Take a drink, good friend of Jonah." He held the whiskey bottle out to Kenton. "A last request before you die? 'Cause Jason is a-comin'. Oh, on that you can rely. So take the whiskey bottle up and drink." Freely punched the bum in the mouth and brought the sustained note to a sudden finish. Then he snatched the bottle from Jonah's hand and threw it on the ground. The glass shattered with threatening clarity. Still reeling from the blow, Jonah spun like a confused tornado before finally rebounding off the side of the pickup and falling on his ass. "You're gonna die for this. This place is cursed," he drawled. "Think so?" Freely's eyes were like needles of ice. He bent down and picked up the broken bottleneck. Jonah took one look at the jagged cylinder and knew exactly what Kenton planned to do with it. Quickly, the wino dragged himself over to the bushes. "You're gonna die," he ranted, diving for cover through the leaves and then fleeing for his life. "All of you! You shouldn't have come here! This is Jason's town! Jason's! There's a death curse!" "Yeah," shouted Freely. "We'll send this Jason my way and I'll kick his friggin' ass as well." Francis Grissom spat the chunk of prime Voorhees out of his mouth. Strands of black slime hung from his teeth and dribbled down his chin. There were lumps in it. "Tastes like shit," announced Francis, no longer raving. He'd calmed down just as quickly as he'd lost his temper, because now he had culinary concerns on his mind. "Get off the family table," wheezed Ma pathetically. Francis ignored her and gave more thought to the problem of what to do with Jason. "Still," he said, weighing up the possibilities, "within the right seasonings, after all, there's a lot of meat on the boy." "Let me try," suggested Enoch, who had finally stopped laughing. Now he too wanted to see what raw zombified psycho tasted like. Pork? Chicken? He leaned over Jason's body, then dug his fingers into the open wound, hooked his nails under a soft ridge of flesh, and pulled. Francis jumped down from the table and looked on as his brother tugged at the weeping injury. "Tough, ain't it?" he commented, as if in revenge on Enoch for laughing when his knife had become stuck. Enoch ignored him and continued tearing at the meat until eventually a scrap came loose. He raised the piece and turned it in his fingers. It looked bad. He held it close to his nose and sniffed. It smelt bad. He put the revolting chunk of flesh in his mouth and chewed it. "You're right," he said to his younger brother. "It does taste like shit." "But I can do something about that," boasted Francis. Then he set about hacking more gobbets out of the hole in Jason's chest, so that he could toss them over for Ma and Pa to try. The first piece landed in Pa's lap. When the old Rawbones saw it, he lifted the black strip of Jason up against his mouth and slowly swiveled his head, so that his lips crawled along the meat like a masturbating tapeworm. But when Francis threw a sample at Ma, she just let it bounce off her face and fall to the floor. "Get off in the family table," she whined. "Ma!" screamed Francis. "You blind fucking whore! I'm off the family fucking table." "Now don't you go disrespecting the family table," chided Enoch as he sucked on the dark Voorhees sludge coating his teeth. Francis slammed his knife into the tabletop, the blade stabbing the wood mere inches from Jason's right hand. "Shut your mouth, man tits," he shouted. "If anyone's disrespecting the family table, it's you. You were the one who put 4 trees on it. You're treating the family table like it's fucking chopping board. You gonna get a pail of fucking water and wash off the blood like it's Thanksgiving? You got no respect." Enoch slowly curled his hands into fists. "Don't go making me get the red friggin' haze again." But Francis was too angry to give a damn. "You know what I think of your red haze, man tits? I could fucking shit the fucker. Now get the fucking stove on before I lose my patience." The older Grissom boy considered killing his lazy loudmouth of a brother, but he was caught short by a rumble in his stomach. Seemed like it really was time to get dinner going after all, with Jason Voorhees as the main item on the menu. Enoch piled some logs on the range and started banging about with pots and pans, all too small. He went outside and found the old tin bathtub they used for skinning, but it was still too small, unless they cut Jason up first. It was getting pretty dark out now, full moon in the sky. The Grissom brother dragged the tub back inside the cabin and lifted it onto the range. Then he set about filling it with water, a tedious job that meant taking a pot back and forth to the faucet. However, a few minutes later, a tub full of water was gently on the boil, which meant it was time to get the meat ready. Enoch took a cleaver down from the knife rack and went over to where Jason lay on the family table. Ma was fast asleep, and Pa was still chomping away on his piece of 4 trees. Only now the senile old bastard was sniggering too. Enoch sniffed and raised the cleaver, ready to bring it down across Jason's neck. "What you doing?" It was Francis. He had been spending all this time flicking through a recipe book. "Getting him in the pot," said Enoch, lining up the blow. Francis threw the book aside, grabbed his knife from the family table, and thrust the festering blade into Enoch's right arm. Enoch howled and let go of the cleaver. The bone knife had penetrated at least an inch beneath the skin, and blood was pouring into the sleeve of his shirt. He gripped the wound and backed off. There were a whole lot of weapons on the knife rack. Or maybe he could just whack his lunatic brother with a skillet. "What'd you do that for?" he shouted, stalling for time. "You told me to cook the fucker, so I'm putting him in the pot. I'm gonna boil him." But Francis was beyond reason. He just stood holding the knife, livid with rage, his whole body an expression of feral hatred. "You ain't boiling no one," he hissed. "Jason Voorhees is gonna be spit roasted." Trick rapped at the door a 5th time. Still no answer. "Trick, honey," moaned Zemal, worried that the shack was going to be yet another dead end, but desperately hoping it wasn't. "Babe, what am I supposed to do?" Trick was just as anxious as his girlfriend. "You're the captain," she said. "Do something." "Like what? Go inside?" "I can't do that." Trick shone his flashlight back over the clearing. The place was a dump. There was garbage and scraps of wood everywhere, but the one thing Trick couldn't find was any sign of life. There was no light, no sound, no movement, nada. On top of which, the boy was concerned that all the windows had been boarded from the inside. Sure, there were gaps in the makeshift shutters, enough to see it was dark in there, but that kind of interior design hardly inspired confidence. And Glow still hadn't joined them. In fact, Trick hadn't seen the girl since he and Zemal had come around looking for the door. He knocked once again. Zemal was growling irritable. "You really need to go in. If there's no one in there, no one will find out." "Nice equation, Einstein, but if your logic is so fucking true, I'll let you take the props for proving it." Trick posed like an usher and stood aside so that his girl could make the grand entrance. "You want me to do it?" She tried to sound argumentative, but came across like a finalist for Miss Yellowstreak 2005. "Yup," answered Trick, "and I'll just wait out here, and when I hear someone rev up their fucking chainsaw, I'll run so fast you better be Flojo too. Maybe someone who's still alive might be a better starting point." Zemal fired a loud tut and folded her arms. "Can I interrupt the meeting, Norman?" "Don't you fucking baits me, Zero." But her insult had served to shift the subject away from Trick entering the shack. Zemal opened her mouth to retaliate when she heard a twig snap behind her. Trick heard it too. They whirled around and he aimed his flashlight to reveal. "Glow!" shouted the boy, scared out of his skin. "Creep factor 10! Jesus fucking Christ on a cracker!" Both he and Zemal sagged with relief, but their comfort evaporated when they realized Glow wasn't paying them the slightest attention. They were even more freaked out by the song she was singing. It sounded like a nursery rhyme. "This is the house that Jason built, Jason built, Jason built. This is the house that Jason built on a warm and bloody day." Trick shook his head. "All right, this has gone on way long enough. We surrendered, joke over, call out your friends." Then he cupped his hands over his mouth and shouted, "Hello! Game over! Game over, man!" Zemal tried to shut him up, while Glow slipped between the two of them and reached for the handle of the cabin door. "Don't!" shrieked Zemal. Too late. Glow turned the handle, pushed open the rickety door, and stepped inside. The girl didn't even have her flashlight on. Trick leaned forward to see what he could, but the door swung shut in his face. Glow had gone in there alone, and she'd closed the door. Trick looked at Zemal. Zemal looked at Trick. They didn't want to say a word. Friendship decreed they should go inside, but fear made the tentative suggestion that it just might be preferable for them both to wait outside the door. Trick could almost hear his old man back in Seattle. "Well, Richard, my boy, you go sneaking off across the country searching for serial killers. What do you expect? An afternoon in fucking Disney World?" Zemal was having exactly the same experience. It was as if the two of them were at some halfway house along the road to having their entire lives flash before their very eyes. Zemal was imagining what her mom would say if she could see her daughter right now. Whatever! But suddenly the image was shattered by an unmistakable sound tearing from the other side of the closed door. Trick and Zemal recognized it at once. It was the sound of Glow screaming. Ma slithered out of her armchair and shuffled over towards the kitchen end of the room. If there was any cooking to be done in the Grissom household, she'd be the one to do it. She wasn't so old that she didn't know her obligations. Besides, now that her sons were fooling around, no one was watching the pot. Francis with the knife, Enoch with the cleaver. The boys had gone crazy, a-snarling and a-fighting, trying to kill each other like they'd got nothing better to do. They were always the same. Maybe Ma should have listened to Pa when he told her to strangle the boys at birth. But then if she had, who'd bring home the meat? Ma picked a dead raccoon off of Jason's belly. She could tell it was one of Francis's because two of its legs had been pulled off. Then she went over to the range. The water in the tub was good and hot now. It was all bubbles and steam. She tried to tell her boys to shut up, but they kept hollering and yelling. If they carried on that way, she'd send them to bed with no food. Enoch swung the cleaver and caught Francis in the thigh. "Boys are like your pa," drawled Ma to no one in particular. And then she lifted the coon, fur and all, and dropped it into the boiling pot, still breathing and wriggling. Stunned and near to extinction, the raccoon was shocked into its final death throes by the unbearable heat of the water. The critter screeched and, with its remaining limbs, kicked a wave of scalding liquid all over Ma's face. Her leathery skin blistered as she went prancing around the room wailing, barely avoiding the knife and cleaver as they swung around her like a cloud of flies. What was with the kids fighting and Ma burning and crying, her face like a red balloon? Pa snickered so much he'd gone let out a real tight fart. Meanwhile, Trick kicked open the door and burst into the shack. He was holding the flashlight forward in both hands like a gun. Zemal huddled up close and peered over his shoulder as he aimed the light all around the room. The inside of the cabin reminded him of TV footage he'd seen of houses in the Middle East, after the wire-guided missiles had done their job, the only difference being that none of the domestic debris in the hovel was less than 30 years old. Straight across the door was a crudely made cubicle containing a disgusting toilet. To the left, Trick saw an empty cupboard, and beyond that some planks had fallen to the ground. There were a couple of windows all nailed up, but no real furniture in the small room, no attempt at decoration, and the floor was just a layer of dirt strewn with garbage and scraps of old newspaper. The hut looked like a treehouse built by a lobotomy patient. There! Zemal pointed across the room. Over in the far corner to their left was a doorway. Trick didn't know how he'd missed it the first time. Maybe because everything was brown and gray and it was too damn dark. The door was no more than a thin sheet of iron fixed to a wooden frame. There were 2 large holes in the metal, at around head height. The punctures bent inwards as if someone had attacked the door with a pickaxe. It couldn't have been done while Trick and Zemal were outside, or they would have heard it. The ajar door opened inwardly, giving access to another room. Quickly, Trick ran his flashlight a second time over the walls, but the half-open door was definitely the only other way out. "Come on," he whispered, taking Zemal by the hand. The poor girl shivered with fear. "I'm not sure this is a good idea," she hissed. Trick smiled, trying to reassure her, and then took his first step into the shack. He stopped, almost as if expecting to fall through a trap door. But nothing happened, and the hut was deathly silent. "Let go of me," said Zemal, trying to shake off his vice-like grip. "You want to wait out there without a flashlight?" he asked, waving the beam. "Alone?" Zemal bit her lip. She had to admit to herself that he had a couple of very good points. "All right," she said, "but be careful." Trick turned the light backwards towards the metal door and tiptoed across the room. He couldn't hear a single footstep behind him, but Zemal's sweet breath wafted over the back of his neck. That's how close she was. Using me as a shield, Trick thought. His heart pounded as he crept up to the door and eased it wide open. But he almost puked at the smell that came out to meet him. The air from the inner room was foul, like something had died and then died again. But there was no sign of Glow's flashlight. If she was in there, she had to be standing in the dark. "Glow?" he called gently, still reeling from the stink. He waited a moment, but there was no reply. "Let's get out of here," urged Zemal, but Trick had already made up his mind to go further. Money couldn't buy moments like this. It was like living in one of his favorite slasher movies. Only Crystal Lake was real. But he still had to find Glow, the messed-up little screwball. Trick covered his nose with his left hand and then shone his flashlight into the room. Glow was the first thing that he saw. Despite her earlier scream, the girl seemed unharmed. She was standing beside a heap of rubble that lay just in front of the door. It looked as if part of the ceiling had caved in years ago. Trick called to her again, but she didn't budge. She just kept staring, transfixed, looking towards the far side of the tiny windowless room. Blair Witch Project all over again, he thought. Afraid of what he might be about to see, Trick slowly angled the light in the direction of the friend's gaze. "Holy shit!" He almost dropped the flashlight. Zemal screamed. On the other side of the room stood a round table with 3 rotted corpses lying at its feet. Trick was no expert, but he guessed the bodies must have been there for decades. Their eyes were completely gone, and the skin beneath their clothes had shriveled back to the bone. As for the table itself, it was weird enough to disturb Trick and Zemal far more than the sight of the decomposed remains. It had been set up like some kind of shrine. Its round surface acted as a dais of spent candles, while the corpses on the ground comprised an offering. the whole of it forming a temple dedicated to an unholy relic that had remained here, forgotten and unworshipped, for almost 25 years. For there, sitting on the table amid the melted stubs of wax, was the severed head of Mrs. Pamela Voorhees. Okay, this has been Chapter 3 of Friday the 13th Carnival of Maniacs. What a chapter, guys. I don't know about you, but I'm really enjoying the story. Each set of characters in their own way are very interesting. Gotta admit, I'm having a lot of fun with the Killbillies. That family is just so much fun. And I just know Jason's gonna come to at some point. They're not gonna be able to eat him, right? Right? Anyways, guys, let me know in the comment section what you think. What do you think of Pamela's imminent return? And I'll be seeing you very soon with more of Friday the 13th Carnival of Maniacs. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying thanks for listening, and it's got a death curse!